Welcome viewers to the series Exploring Careers in Technology's New Frontiers. This is the third episode in the series Automated Vehicles. My name is Jachi, class of 2022 at Middlebury College, and I would like to introduce this episode's guest speaker. I'm joined today by Alden Woodrow, class of 2002, co-founder and CEO of Ike, a developer of automated trucking technology that was recently acquired by Neuro in January 2021. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Alden.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Alden, would you like to give us a brief introduction of yourself?
Sure thing. So as you mentioned, most recently, I was one of the founders of a company that was working on building automated trucks, also known as self-driving trucks or autonomous trucks. That's a project that we worked on over the last couple of years and recently sold the company to a larger player in our space. I've spent the last 10 years or so working in new technology development, particularly in really complex, multidisciplinary, very technical product development on things like robot trucks, as well as previously on projects like a flying wind turbine technology, which maybe we'll talk about. That was a startup that got acquired by Google in 2013. And so I've had the opportunity to work at both small companies, including starting one, as well as some of the large tech companies like Google and Uber, and been very lucky to get to see pretty wide variety of approaches to building new technologies here in Silicon Valley. I actually was not a technical focused student at Middlebury. I majored in economics and philosophy, and I actually spent the first several years of my career as a consultant doing economic consulting and environmental consulting. So coming from a pretty unusual background to be working mostly with engineers in a very new technology field. And so I may talk about that a little bit today, but feel really lucky to have found this path forward and get to work on some really exciting stuff. I live in Oakland, California in the Bay Area. My wife also went to Middlebury. She was fed with me, class of 2002.5. And we have two daughters here in Oakland, hopefully future Middlebury students.
Awesome. So Alden, this series features various professional areas involved in the new frontiers of technology. If you can tell us a little bit about Ike, where it fits within the automated vehicle industry, what the current and future landscape looks like after its recent acquirement by Neuro, and lastly, what do you do in your role?
Sure. Ike was, as I mentioned, focused on building automation technology for trucks. The idea was to allow Class 8 tractors, the semi-trucks that you see out on the highways, to drive without a driver. And that is on the back of now many years of effort here in Silicon Valley across a number of companies to try to automate vehicles. That started, of course, with some projects funded by DARPA, by the US government, to try to develop these automated vehicles a number of years ago. Google has invested most heavily and over the longest time frame in this technology, starting with a project called Chauffeur back in 2010 or so. And then many companies have kind of evolved since then to work on automated vehicles. Silicon Valley is in part of this new wave over the last few years of realizing, I think, that there are opportunities to automate not just passenger cars, but other vehicles that might be easier to get to market, have unique applications, or might be more valuable. And so my colleagues and I got really excited about trucking in particular, something I could certainly talk about more, but the opportunity to automate these Class 8 trucks that, to maybe just give a little bit of background on that part of the industry. Many people don't realize that trucks are really kind of the backbone of America's economy. They move essentially everything that we eat and use and wear every day. And truck drivers in particular bear a lot of cost and risk and have really tough lifestyles in order to move things around our country in these large vehicles. And so we saw an opportunity to help save lives and increase the productivity of our transportation system and help make truck drivers' lives better in ways that I could get into, but to focus on kind of automating these vehicles. A big driver of all of this interest, other than the fact that it's really interesting technology, of course, is that tens of thousands of people die in car accidents and other related vehicle accidents every year in the United States. And so there is this massive opportunity to apply new technologies that have emerged over the last few years in robotics and elsewhere to help make driving around in the world safer. And so that's a huge driver for this is a huge motivator, I think, for many people. Certainly has become a passion of mine in learning about some of these challenges, in addition to the things that are specific to trucking. So, anyways, that's sort of a starting point overview. Part of the reason that Silicon Valley and also incumbent automakers and industrial companies are really starting to pay attention to these technologies. So, quick summary there, I think, in terms of the state of the world. It's important to note that to a large degree, automated vehicles do not exist today in the real world. These are almost entirely still R&D projects. And whether it's Google, who's made quite a lot of progress, but has spent over 10 years now working on this technology, or smaller, newer companies like mine that has had still quite a lot of work left to do before we had a real product in the world. There's certainly other approaches to this. Tesla, of course, has their assisted driving system that they've marketed as kind of an automation solution. A lot of controversy about that, of course. So there are a few places where this technology is starting to come into the real world, but to a large degree, this is still in the development phase. And part of the implication of that is, which we may talk about more, is that the vast majority of people working in automated vehicles are doing engineering. And so I have a pretty unusual role in the sense that I'm not an engineer. I'm not writing code. I'm not designing the hardware system that we're using, but I spend a lot of my time working with the people who do that. And it does have some implications for, Middlebury students, maybe those who are majoring in computer science, but also those who are focused in a more kind of classical liberal arts type of study. So in terms of my role at Ike, so as you mentioned, the company was acquired just a few weeks ago. And so I'm at a transition point now, and I'll talk about a lot of these things in past tense. I'm now working at Neuro and helping them with a variety of things. But in my role at Ike, I was, of course, one of the first people in the door because I helped start the company with a couple of my engineering colleagues who were co-founders. I did a really wide variety of things as the CEO of the company, working at a startup in Silicon Valley, and in particular being the founder of a startup is a really, really exciting but very complex job. We together, and this was certainly the case for me, we're focused on a pretty wide variety of things, from building the company, which is to say attracting talented people and hiring them, helping set a culture for the company about the sorts of ways we want to work together and what our values are, building excitement and momentum and inspiration for the goals that we have as a company. And then outside of the kind of internal efforts, raising capital for the company. So working with investors who are interested in investing in Ike and helping support us in achieving those goals, and then working with outside partners. So those would be customers or other partnerships that allow us to build our technology or get it into the market. I worked with regulators and policymakers who are responsible for helping set the right context for legal operation of the technology. And the list kind of goes on and on. But that's one of the things that has always been most exciting to me about this field, and the positions that I've been lucky to have, is to get to have the breadth of exposure to a really wide range of folks, right? As I mentioned to you when we were preparing to talk about this, if you're an engineer in one of these companies, you're typically doing very focused work, particularly if you're coming right out of school. You're working on the perception system, or you're designing some piece of the hardware. And that is super valuable and important, but it is also quite focused in terms of who you interact with and what you're working on. And for better or worse, I had the sort of opposite experience at Ike, which was very, very wide scope, and getting the opportunity to work on a pretty huge range of topics and issues, and just try to generally help the company succeed.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very interesting. To move on a little bit, I wonder if you can talk about the topic of challenges. Specifically, what's the challenges that underlie the area, this particular area, the industry, the robotics industry, but also what do you find most challenging in what you do?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I think to go back to what I was saying before about how this technology to a large degree is still in development, right? That one of the challenges is public expectations about automation, about self-driving vehicles. I think to a large degree make people believe that that this technology is already available today, right? The way that it is marketed, the way it's covered in the media, it seems as though we're almost there, right? We're just about to have robots driving around everywhere. And I think depending on the time scale that you measure, that's true, right? So 50 years from now, within the lifetime of Middlebury students, there will be many, many robots driving around doing lots of things, carrying people, carrying goods, delivering groceries, all sorts of things. But that's also quite a ways away until it really is at large scale, is commercially viable, and is an established industry. So we're really at the very, very early stages here still. And I think one of the big challenges is figuring out how to harness that excitement and enthusiasm while also being realistic about how much hard work lies ahead, right? And in particular, something that I think has not gotten enough attention either in our industry or in the world in general is that there are really serious safety implications for having robots move around in the world. You need to do a really exceptionally good job of building systems that are not going to harm people. And it's quite easy. We're used to smartphones and other devices that we use, failing on us or having bugs or crashing in various ways. Those don't happen all that often, but when they do, they're annoyances. And so that sort of thing happening for some kind of automated vehicle is actually much more significant in terms of its implications, right? And so as a society, we've done a good job of, if you look at commercial aircraft, for example, those are extremely safe vehicles and very, very safe operations. But it also took a very long time for the industry to get to the point where we could all ride safely in airplanes so frequently and have so few incidents. And so the people who are serious about developing automated vehicles are really focused on that challenge and acknowledging that as much as there's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm for riding around in a robot in the near future, that it takes a lot of work, a lot of very rigorous technical work, a lot of working with regulators, as I mentioned before, to find the right frameworks for this and make it work in a real way. So that's kind of the primary challenge. Beyond that, there's a lot of really interesting kind of more specific challenges of trying to run a startup and trying to grow, which are having to attract capital. And in particular, venture capital is not a great fit for the sorts of work that we're doing, the sort of thing that's very long-term, that's very technical. It's sort of hard to understand the difference between good technology and bad technology in this world. Attracting talent is really complex, especially here in the Bay Area. Good engineers, talented people, not just engineers, but talented people are very, very in demand and can really dictate where they work. And they care about working at a place that has a meaningful mission with people who they like and want to learn from and whose values match theirs. It's not just about their compensation. It's not just about, the profile of the company. So that's an interesting challenge. Let's see. I think doing all that in the context of COVID-19 this past year, especially where we're all boxes on screens, is especially challenging for our industry because it is so multidisciplinary. It's one thing to work on a group project over Zoom. It's one thing to work on a software project over Zoom. When you're working on a technology that has hardware components and software components and truck drivers who need to get in the vehicle and drive it around, it's really challenging to do all of that remotely. And we definitely experienced some pain in 2020 in trying to continue working effectively together and communicating effectively in that context. So we had a amazing team, great group of people, all of whom are now at Neuro. And we continue to feel some of that pain, but it's a huge challenge at this very moment. Hopefully, in the near future, we can go back to some more efficient ways of working together.
So you were talking about the topic of future here and there. I wonder if you can focus on the future. What is the future of Ike, Neuro, and what does the future of the industry look like? What impact does it have on people and some existing businesses?
Yeah, great question. Maybe I'll talk about Neuro here for a moment. This is the company that recently acquired my company. Neuro is focused on building small vehicles to do local delivery. At least that's sort of the first product that they're building. So these I call them to my kids tiny trucks, but they're these sort of toaster looking vehicles that are about half the size of a car. They drive on streets, not on sidewalks. And their intention is to deliver groceries and pizza and medicine to people and save them time and effort in having to go to the store and run errands or leave the house in the middle of the night if their child is sick, those sorts of things. And so there's quite a lot of overlap in what Neuro is doing and what Ike was doing. The differences are really in the type of vehicle that we were working on, and the specific geography and the use case. So Ike was focused on highway driving. Neuro is focused on surface streets and suburban areas and delivering products to people in what's called the last mile. So sort of local delivery applications. We have a lot of close connections with the Neuro team. They were an investor in our company and a partner of ours. And so it was quite an easy decision to join forces with them, as we did just a couple of weeks ago. I think in terms of the future, where we're now focused as a team, where I'm focused, is on local delivery and automation of consumer product delivery. Neuro has done some pretty amazing things in terms of their technical development. They have partnerships with Kroger, the grocery chain, with CVS, with Walmart, with a number of other partners to help move their goods and products from their stores or from their warehouses to people's homes in a really efficient and safe way. And that's something that our team got really excited about as well. So, what we hope the future holds, and if we do a good job at Neuro, and I think if other companies in our space that have a lot of smart people, if they do a good job at this, the future means much safer roads. It means that we can be out in the roadways, walking around our neighborhoods, riding our bikes, otherwise going from one place to another, and putting ourselves at lower risk because these technologies are gonna just operate at much higher levels of sophistication, be able to see things and react to things in ways that people cannot. And that, I think, is really the primary driver for many people. The other things that hopefully accrue from working on these technologies is to grow our economy and make our transportation system and our economy as a whole much more productive, right? So some people like to say in our industry, it doesn't make sense to deliver a 1 pound burrito with a 1 ton vehicle, right? And so, and I think that's true, right? Today, the growth of food delivery, for example, certainly here in the Bay Area, and I think in many other parts of the country and around the world, means that a person is driving your dinner to you and coming to your doorstep and handing it off to you. And that's super convenient, but it's not very efficient. And it's not really that great of a business, actually. And so there are opportunities, I think, to apply the robotics and other technology developments that we're working on at Neuro and that other companies are working on to do that in a much more efficient way with electric vehicles, with vehicles that are purpose built to do certain set of things. And so we're pretty excited about that future. My kids are really excited about that future. They get the unique opportunity to come and play with some of these things, sit in the trucks or check out these little robots that we're building. And I'm pretty excited about what that means for when they become adults and have an opportunity to live in a world that hopefully sees a lot of these benefits.
Alden, thank you for sharing these insights. It was so interesting to hear about such an exciting industry. I'm also very curious about your own experience from campus to career. As you mentioned in the introduction, you majored in economics and philosophy at Middlebury. You have held positions in consulting, product management, and now you're the CEO of Ike, which was newly acquired by Nero. So how did you get from Middlebury to where you are now?
Yeah, it's a long story, but let me try to make it a little bit shorter. At Middlebury, I think like many students, I did not have a really clear sense of what I wanted to do career-wise. I was there to learn, and I was taking classes I was interested in. I took a wide range of subjects. I did major in philosophy and economics, obviously, but I was really interested in environmental studies. I took some fascinating J-term classes, including a sustainable forestry class where we spent lots of time outdoors in Addison County in the wintertime. I took a modern dance class, and that was one of my favorite classes at Middlebury. So without much clear direction, I tried to just learn a wide variety of things. And, I think I really benefited from being pretty open-minded at that stage. My first job right out of Middlebury was working as an economic consultant. And so I essentially spent a couple of years building financial models and doing quantitative analysis. And I would say very little of what I studied at Middlebury directly contributed to my work in that area. I sort of taught myself or learned how to use Microsoft Excel at the time. This is what I think today would be called data science, but at the time it was just sort of, modeling. And it is actually a little bit hard to draw a line from that to what I'm doing now. But I think the common steps are that I built some expertise in a few areas, and I think we'll probably talk about this more in this conversation. But the main piece of advice that I think I have for Middlebury students is to explore and build a lot of breadth and try different things. But that the things that allowed me, if I look back at my career, to move from one step to another, were having a strong foundation in a particular area. And so let me just talk about those steps a little bit. Working in financial modeling and having that strong core of being able to model the world quantitatively allowed me to get a job doing environmental consulting in San Francisco. I moved from Middlebury to Denver to do that job, and then to San Francisco, and did a pretty strange variety of things, working for environmental nonprofits and foundations, helping them with their environmental strategy, something I knew very little about. But consulting and Middlebury helped prepare me to kind of dive into these things, whether it was understanding how a fishing quota system was working in the Gulf of Mexico, or what doghouse manufacturing looked like for a case that I worked on as an economic consultant. Those were not things I knew anything about, but I was able to learn about them quickly and get excited and curious about them. And that foundation then led to me going to business school, which we can talk about more. So I went to Berkeley and got an MBA. That experience led to working at a startup that was working on a new kind of wind energy technology, which was my first foray into product management and working with engineers on really complex work. And then each step from there was sort of a direct application of going from wind energy technology to trucks, and then trucking into local delivery here with Neuro. And so none of that was planned, as I think very few people plan their careers out in that kind of a way. But the main threads, I would say, are getting excited about a particular area and building some expertise I could rely on, and using that as a foundation for a next career step into an area that I had very little familiarity with, right? So that's sort of one major thing. The other one was just finding great people and working with them. And so if you trace that career path as well, there's a lot of people who are frequent members of my group, of my work set, who I either followed or who followed me. That's a thing that happens a lot in Silicon Valley. But once you find good people who you want to work with, and they go and work on interesting stuff, it opens up new career opportunities. And so there are people who work at Neuro with me now who I worked with at Uber. There are people who I recruited to Ike to work with me, who I worked with at McConney and Google early in my career. And that just kind of happens over time. And it's from building relationships, working on hard and interesting things together, And that is a huge part of, how I've ended up in the place that I have, is mostly luck, honestly, but I think sort of identifying people who I really like working with, who I respect, who I learn things from, and paying attention to where they're going and having good relationships. And that opens up all sorts of interesting opportunities. So, I did not expect to be the founder of a startup. That was not really in my career plan. But I was lucky enough to get to work with some people who thought that I would add something, and would be a valuable partner of theirs. And so sort of was presented with an opportunity that I couldn't say no to. It was just too exciting to get to work with these people, to get to try something, start something new, and kind of make it in our own image. And I'm really glad I did that. It was incredibly difficult, and I have a lot more gray hair after the last few years than I did before. But it really just comes from making those choices step by step, and taking some risks, and wanting to work with people who I respect.
Thank you for sharing your experiences. Next question is particularly relevant to me, and then you've also mentioned this quite a bit previously. Given your work in the industry and your perspective of the future, what are some actionable advice that you will give to the current students to better prepare ourselves to enter into the career field?
I get this question a lot from Middlebury students, and also I think from business school students from my alma mater at Berkeley. I have a few thoughts here. I think the first one I sort of touched on before. I think it's really valuable to have some depth of expertise. And so there's this phrase that gets used in Silicon Valley sometimes called to describe people as T-shaped. And you may or may not be familiar with this, but the idea is that it's people who have a very broad exposure to a wide variety of topics, and have kind of a breadth of skills, and who also have a really deep vertical expertise in a particular area. That might be biology, it might be computer science, it might be financial modeling, any number of things, but that it's very, very valuable to have the ability to learn about new things and have enough exposure to a variety of topics to kind of jump in different areas, but also this really strong foundation of something to rely on. And I think Middlebury and the liberal arts education is really good at providing that horizontal layer, and providing a lot of exposure. I think early in people's careers is a great opportunity to build some of that depth and vertical expertise, because that starts to become really valuable. If you think about people who want to work in technology or at startups, coming out of Middlebury with a liberal arts education, you need to have something that you can argue you're going to contribute, right? And so being able to say, I am an expert on this topic, or I'm going to help contribute in this area. It could be in human resources, it could be in sales, it could be in finance, it could be in computer science. But having something like that, I think, is what's really going to be the hook to help people find those opportunities. That doesn't have to happen right after school, right? It can happen a few years after school, getting some exposure or some experience. But I think increasingly, I'm a believer that, or I should say, I wish that I had spent a little bit more time building more expertise as opposed to breadth, because you get that really nicely at Middlebury, right? And so focusing in some ways, I think, can be super valuable. So I think that's one big thing. The other thing I tend to say a lot is not to worry too much about getting your dream job right after school, right? Everybody coming out of Middlebury is an exceptionally smart, talented, driven person. And you've spent your entire lives up to that point working super hard in ways that are pretty actionable, right? Like you have a class, you have a test, you can get an A on that test, and succeeding in that way. And then you enter the working world and it becomes much more ambiguous, right? And it's sort of hard to figure out how you go from one step to another. My view is that the best strategy is to find something that is interesting to you and is going to help build that expertise, right? And that if it's a step to helping figure out what you're really passionate about, or get another job in the future that might be closer to your real passion, that is a perfectly good way to start. You don't have to kind of hit the jackpot right away, right? And in fact, as I said, I never planned out my career. It worked out in the sense that I took a job that sounded interesting to me and happened to be lucky enough to build some expertise, and that led to some new things. So I didn't do it that way on purpose, but I think if I'm giving advice to students about how to do it on purpose, it's to do something like that. Because if you're trying to get the perfect first thing, it's pretty easy to get disappointed or to have a hard time finding that role. It could happen, but to a large degree, this is a very long game, right? Careers are super long. I'm 20 years out of Middlebury, and I'm only halfway through my career, and so there's plenty of time, even for an old guy like me in my 40s, to still have lots of cool opportunities on the basis of having kind of invested up front in learning things and working with good people, as I said before.
Yeah, I think it seems to me that it's a big step from college, from a liberal arts education to enter into the career field. What do you think are some of the important factors in getting your first job?
It's a good question. I think this happens quite a bit more these days. That internships are incredibly valuable. I didn't really in the late '90s and early 2000s. I think some people were doing internships, but it just wasn't compulsory in the same way that I suspect it is today. At least I know from recruiting students coming from engineering schools, Stanford and Berkeley and elsewhere, they've all worked at Google and Facebook and all these other companies over the course of every summer of their college career. And I think at a minimum, that's useful for a resume, but it also is actually really useful to help expose them to what it's like to work in one of these companies. So it doesn't have to be Google or Facebook. And in fact, there are some downsides to working at companies like that, in my experience. But I think some real exposure to doing the sorts of things that you're interested in a work context are really valuable. That probably goes without saying. I'm sure like every Middlebury student is doing lots of internships these days, but I do think that's valuable. I think working in other contexts is valuable. So when I was in business school, I worked at a startup for almost the entire second year of business school. I was a little bit older than most of my colleagues, and I had the benefit of being married, so we had some additional income, and I had the flexibility to do that. But that was the startup that I ended up working for after business school, because every Friday I would go sit in their office and work with the CEO and learn about what they were doing. So if there are opportunities to work on things part-time, during school or otherwise, I think that's really valuable. There's really no replacement, I think, for that sort of direct experience. And then otherwise, it's just about being open-minded about adjusting to that new context and that new environment, right? Like working is very different than being in school, and just sort of trying to absorb the routines and the rhythms and the expectations of what it's like to be a professional, employee for 8, 10, whatever hours a day versus the routines associated with school. I think especially this generation of college students has a little bit of reputation of having a hard time adjusting to that. And I think, coronavirus has made that worse, because everyone's still, we have folks on our team who are still living with their college roommates because they can't go anywhere, right? And so they're still in this kind of college environment, and that's fine. But it is actually useful to make that transition into, the workplace, and hopefully we'll all get back to offices pretty soon, and that'll make things a little bit easier.
Awesome. It's super useful and interesting to hear about your own career path and experiences. Well, Alden, thank you once again for your engagement with us in helping students to prepare for their first career destinations.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes this episode within the series, Exploring Careers in Technology's New Frontiers. In closing, I would like to encourage viewers to tune in to get career perspectives and advice from a number of professionals in a broad variety of organizations in our other episodes in this series. I also want to encourage you to tune in to the other MIDDVantage series, which can be accessed through the Events and Programs tab on the CCI website. Thank you so much for watching.